for sustainable finance. So now you know why he's famous. I have Elia Triple from the OECD, from the green finance team there, who's a policy analyst and has a long and illustrious history working in the European Commission, so knows the insides of the machine by which we manage democracy in the European Union. We have Svetlina Kuzmanova, who's a policy advisor at E3G, a leading European environmental NGO. We have Jonas Celsus from the Bellona Europe Foundation, who's director there, and of course the co-sponsor with the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is where I am. I'm the CEO of that organization, a global NGO working on mobilizing capital for climate action. We're here to talk about the Complementary Delegated Act, which is a piece of legislation currently before the European Parliament for approval. We'll get some details from Michael for a minute where that's up to and what's happening, which proposes a extension to the existing European taxonomy. The taxonomy is an act of Parliament that came into force on 1st of January this year, which is clear guidance for what can be called sustainable in Europe, which is a necessary resource for disclosure legislation. You might have heard of acronyms like CSFRD and SFRD and so on. Let's just say disclosure regulations for corporations, banks, and investors about what they're allowed to call sustainable and how they have to report annually to regulators about it. It also is a tool for the green bond market under the European Green Bond Standard that is currently before the European Parliament as well at the moment. So it's meant to govern everything to do with green and sustainable in Europe. And it's meant to be a common language for what we call sustainable, in line, as per the objectives of the Taxonomy Act, with our climate change goals. And by that, I mean mitigation as well as adaptation and resilience. We're absolutely necessary now that we're starting to experience serious climate change. Europe, of course, has made substantive commitments to emission reductions by 2030, broadly in line with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said we need to achieve by 2030. Sure, we should be doing more. We'll always need to work on doing more, but we already have ambitious goals. Of course, more recently in Repower EU, and I'll be asking the team about that a little later, we've seen a restating of some of the ambitions in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the implications for Europe's fossil fuel policy. You know, as you might know, the Ukrainian war, the Russian war in Ukraine, is frankly being financed by Europe. Since the Russian government engineered, according to the International Energy Agency, an increase in fossil fuel prices last autumn, Europe has paid extra fees for its fossil fuel imports to Russia, way higher than the amount of money they've expended on the Russian war. So effectively, Europe has been financing this war, which is just madness. And of course, that's underpinned the discussions, the argument, the somewhat robust discussion that's underway in Europe at the moment about removing our reliance on Russian fossil fuels. And the question I'm asking today, is this particular act in line with that? Well, let's see how we go. You're with us today because you care about sustainable finance, because you're interested in the green transition, because you're interested in achieving these goals. You know what the challenges are. You possibly heard what the IPCC reports are saying. You've read the science. If we don't make these changes, we face an utterly catastrophic future for a society, for the planet, for all species, not just the human species. That's the stakes here. If we do make these changes, we build a cleaner, greener, safer planet. That's the fork in the road. So that's the background story. But let's get down to the detail here. 2 points of information. You can ask questions. If you use the chat function, type in a question and I will relay it to the group. No, we're not going to let you talk it out loud because we've got too many people and it's way too complicated, but I am looking for questions to ask and I'll pick ones to put to the audience, to the panelists going through. 2, this session is being recorded and will be available afterwards on YouTube and other places, details to come, which means everything's on the record. So we get a chance to hear Michael Bloss saying things on the record. Very exciting. Michael, I think that's a cue to turn to you. Can you give us a bit of an overview about what's going on and maybe your thoughts on why as part of the process, so everyone can understand?
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation. And I didn't know that it was my SOAS alumni ship that qualified me, but that's great. There's not so many SOAS alumni I know in the European Parliament, so maybe we should, or in the European sphere altogether. So maybe there should be some kind of more connections in between, because it was a very, very great time at SOAS that I spent there in London for 1 year. Now, as you said, I think, keeping in mind where we are right now, we know what is coming from the IPCC. Actually, 2 weeks ago, the German meteorological organizations said that already by 2026, we could be for the first time on a global average above 1.5 degrees. So that's in 4 years. And still in Glasgow, all countries, all members of the Paris Agreement said that the 1.5 degree is still our objective. So we really have to get going and have to get going fast. And the climate crisis is not slowing down. It's actually accelerating. So currently on the European level, we are doing a lot for new climate policies. Still, unfortunately, always with the knowledge that it's not enough to meet 1.5 degrees, probably also not enough to meet the 2-degree goal. But there are like huge things going on, and next week is one of the main weeks. We will vote on the biggest climate package, the emission trading, the end of fossil combustions, hopefully end of fossil cars, on LULUCF, so how many trees we want to plant. So this is all big. Now, the week after, there will be the vote on the taxonomy. And it is really interesting to see that there is a lot of talks about the taxonomy, and the taxonomy is only a delegated act. It's not even a legal act. But normally you would say, okay, but then it's not that important, but it is really important. And the reason is, as you explained, that it's for the first time a classification of what is to be sustainable and what not. And we need this classification in order to have a guidance for the future, where to invest, where to put also taxpayers' money in. And the point is why it is becoming so important that everyone understands now that sustainability is the future and the only future. But that, of course, also means that those who are not sustainable want to be labeled as sustainable. And that is what is currently happening. That kind of the old world understanding that their kind of time has come to go, now want to pretend to be part of the new world without changing, really. And this is the political fight that we are currently having. And therefore, this taxonomy is not only about like a second delegated act, but it's really about the question, what we want for this new world to come. And here we saw that especially, Macron and France, but then also the gas lobby, they were trying to be really part of this new world, even though we know, and it was said repeatedly also inside the European Parliament by the experts, for instance, Nathan Fabian, the head of the Sustainable Investment Platform, that in no way the second delegated act is compatible with the 1.5 degree goal, in no way. Also, if we put gas in, if we would label gas as sustainable, gas has an average higher CO2 emission than the average emission of our electricity grid altogether. So we label something that is actually worse than average as sustainable. So we must not do this, and this is the fight that we will be fighting. I think important for us and also important for, yeah, maybe Germany and the conservatives is also the assessment of nuclear. There is a report by a commission, a research institution that basically says long-term storage of high-risk nuclear waste is safe. Now, funnily enough, there is no long-term storage in the world. It doesn't exist. It's not there. So we don't know whether this is safe or not. We know that for the next well, hundreds of millions of years, we need to store it safely. But you know, like now humanity, well, civilized humanity, I don't know, maybe 6,000, 5,000 years old. So we cannot really, you know, credibly say that we can store a nuclear safely for such a long time. Still, the Commission says so, and this is highly problematic. And a third dimension to it is, of course, the question is really, you know, do we get all of our efforts into renewables, or do we split the finance between renewables and nuclear and gas? And so there is like a trade-off. I mean, I heard now for like the whole financial investments, it's not that much of an issue. I wonder if this is true. Maybe you can comment later on it. But for sure, this taxonomy will not only be a guidance for investments in the private sector, but already now we use the taxonomy in legislative text and reference it. And surely there is already attempts, for instance, from France, Italy, to say that investments into the sustainable transformation should be taken off the European kind of whatever the English term, the European debts. So if you are investing into the transformation, this should not be counted onto your debt. So if you like want to stick with the financial compact, so not making more debt than 60% of your GDP, the investments into the transformation should not be counted to this.
Which is a really cool idea, Michael. I'm going to say
it's a great idea.
It's not going to be very, very popular in the Bundesbank, of course, but it's a really cool idea. But it requires us to be very clear about what qualifies that, right?
Absolutely. So the point is that if now nuclear is in and gas is in, it also means that, for instance, maybe in the future, you know, Europe will invest public money into nuclears. That means German taxpayers will pay for French nuclear power plants. I don't think I can explain that at home. And I don't think that conservatives can explain that at home as well.
But also haven't we just in the middle of an energy crisis in Europe when gas prices are huge, energy prices are huge, and we're short of power because Bulgaria and Poland have been cut off? Don't we have 50% of all nuclear plants in France offline because they're not able to operate? They have to require fixing, 50%.
And that's basically the reason why France is pushing so much for this, because if they will have to refurbish, and they plan to refurbish some of their power plants, but this is so expensive that if they would do it via state investment, they would never have the chance to meet the European debt criteria. And therefore, they are trying to push that into the taxonomy to make it the blueprint for what is being exempted from the debt criteria in order to make the investments into the nuclear power plants. That's kind of, I mean, that's the reason why it's so political. Otherwise, it's a second delegated act. Normally, heads of states do not deal with with delegated acts, but that's the reason why it became so politically important. So now, just let me. Sorry, I'm already taking.
Please go.
Just let me finish. Like, I think now the next month is really completely key to whether we will have a functioning taxonomy or not. And that's also key for the world, because everyone is looking at the European taxonomy, and the Japanese taxonomy that's actually better. They are now considering to weaken and water down their taxonomy if the Europeans are also doing it. So this is really kind of an important situation. In, as I said, probably in 2 weeks, so probably on the 14th of June, we will vote in the ENVI and in the Econ committee. This is 149 people that will vote on it. Currently, we see around 65 that will vote with us against this delegated act, 63 that vote in favor, and we need 75 in order to be sure. So there's some undecided. So it's really close. And then 3 weeks later, in the first week of July, so around possibly around 5th of July, we will vote in this in the whole parliament. If we get a no vote here, this second delegated act will be dead. It will not go through. But we need to have an absolute majority of 353 votes. And what is already clear is that Greens, Left, Social Democrats will vote, well, almost like unanimously against this second delegated act. The Liberals, with the kind of French spearheading them, of course, will vote in favor. And now it really boils down to the Conservatives. They will be the swing vote, and especially Conservatives in Germany will be a swing vote because they're big. But here I'm hopeful, because we have, on the one hand, the whole financial world that really does not want it, because if this is there, then also the credibility of the taxonomy is not there anymore. You can basically not market your products with taxonomy compatible, because in Germany at least no one will buy it. They say, I don't want to put my money into nuclear. So the financial world is on our side. I think the renewable world is on our side, because it's also the question, will hydrogen be in the future produced from renewables, or will it be produced from nuclear? So there is the chance, but in order for this to be really a chance, we really need to win the vote in committee. So yeah, looking forward to this next month, and I'm planning to win. So I hope you can help me in this. We need you.
We will see what we can do, Michael. But thank you for that great overview. I'd like to now turn to Elia at OECD to just give us a bit of a background view of what's going on globally on these sorts of issues, including taxonomies. Michael's referred to other taxonomies that Europe needs to be cognizant of. Can you give us a bit of a picture of what's going on and what the backstory is and the global story?
Sure. Thank you, Sean. I'd be very happy to do that, because I think Michael has given a fantastic overview of what's happening at European level. So this could fit quite well. So I think what I would like to just bring that back to where do these gas criteria fit into the taxonomy regulation? They're within this category of what are called transition activities. Now, we can argue as to whether they comply with the legal definition or not. That's a separate conversation. But so there's this idea that transition activities need to be part of the sustainable finance space and part of the green transition overall. And that is internationally becoming more and more important. And Sean, you know this very well, because CBI is, of course, spearheading those efforts as well, working on transition finance and trying to make that credible. But the basic idea is that you need to make sure that all sectors in the economy are part of the green transition, and that all countries globally are part of the green transition. And that's why you have this discussion about transition activities, transition finance, and what is in, what is out. And you've referred to other taxonomies that are out there. There are some taxonomies that have transition activities. There are also some transition finance approaches that are not taxonomies. So you have principles, you have guidelines, for example, in Japan. You have this new focus on transition plans, which is something that's also happening at European level, where, for example, what will end up in the European taxonomy is going to be incredibly important, because credible corporate transition plans fundamentally also depend on the good use of robust taxonomies. So that's something we're working on at the OECD, for example. We're working on this guidance on transition finance that's focused on credible corporate transition plans. But so you have all of these different initiatives internationally, and what they all have in common is that they want to ensure that all of the sectors within national economies are somehow part of the green transition. Now, the gas question is interesting because there the context is a little bit different. And I think, to really be able to understand the context, we have to, for a brief moment, just forget the question of whether something is green or not. Because when it comes to energy, what countries are really interested in outside of sustainability considerations are basically two things. It's energy security and baseload, and it's economic development and performance. And I think Michael alluded to that already in his introduction, that this is not necessarily a discussion about what's green, what's not green. It's a discussion about economic performance and about energy security. And those are the conversations that drive kind of the eligibility discussions in the transition finance space that we're observing around the world, and which sectors should be eligible, which sectors should not be eligible. And different countries will have different priorities for inclusion. And you see that at European level with the European and the nuclear and the gas question. And of course, some of that depends also on the enabling environment, like whether there are existing fossil fuel subsidies in that country, whether they have a robust carbon pricing mechanism, how important certain industries are, whether those industries need a lot of gas, for example, whether there is a national industry that exports skills, technologies, jobs to other parts of the world. So that's one side of the coin. And then there is the other side, and I think, Sean, you already alluded to that at the start. There is science and climate science, and most recently, the statements that were published by the IPCC in April of this year. And I think there are two that we have to focus on. One is that they very clearly stated that existing and currently already planned fossil fuel infrastructure will exceed the emission budget that we have in order to get to 1.5. And I was not aware of the statement by the German Meteorological Organization, but I will check that out because that is terrifying. And part of the IPCC statement in connection to that was that emissions have to peak before 2025. Now, how do you reconcile that with this question of economic development, with this question of which activities should be part of the transition and which should not? And every country will come to different conclusions. And again, it's not necessarily a question of sustainability, because you either find an alternative, in this case renewables, and you make the decisions that you need to make in order to make those renewables feasible. And that's not just building more wind parks, that is reinforcing the grid, investing into storage, investing into transmission infrastructure and everything that comes with that. Or you make the political decision based on what you consider to be feasible within your country, and you say, no, I will continue investing into this fossil fuel infrastructure, but I will put in place safeguards. That's what we have in the CDA. And that's what some of these other approaches that I talked about are also doing. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but the danger with this is that you end up having to put criteria in place that need to operate over a longer time horizon. A lot of investors don't invest that long term. That's one problem. Some investors will only have an investment horizon of maybe 5 years, but the asset lifetime is 20 or 25 years. And then, of course, you have the question of the robustness of the criteria. What if you rely on a criterion that refers back to lifetime emissions of an asset, and that asset has a lifetime of 25 years? And you put in place a framework where the changes can be made towards the end of that lifetime, and then in the end, the asset is not compliant with the criteria, but it counted as green at the start when it was invested into, and the infrastructure was built, which is then the problem that we get with the IPCC conclusions. Similarly, you have questions around supply of low carbon gases, things like that. If emissions have to peak before 2025, you can argue that 2025 would have to be the year that infrastructure switches to completely low carbon gases, or at least the majority of low carbon gases, in order to be compliant with the science that we know exists. And so then you have a question of where do you get the hydrogen supply, where do you get the low carbon, other low carbon gas supply, and that is, I think many transition finance approaches and some of the things that we see out there is not sufficiently considered. And the problem is kind of being pushed back towards 2040, after 2035, which is just unfortunately too late when you look at the science that we have. So that would be my 2 cents. Sean, you're on mute, I think.
Indeed, as ever. So there's a real issue of people wanting to do something and then thinking, oh, it's a bit hard. What about we just do this? That keeps on repeating itself, right? That's what we've been doing in policy circles for 30 years now, since we've been started to talk about climate. And, it looks like this, we're hitting one of the implications of this. In Europe, we've been saying this in Europe for 30 years. We want to do this, but it looks really hard. What about we just do this, including leave the fossil fuels going for a bit longer? And now, of course, we're in a situation where for geopolitical reasons, for energy security reasons, we're forced to deal in a really sharp way with the reduction of fossil fuel usage because we're relying on Russia to import it. And presumably this is exactly the same wall is going to be hit with the climate circles. What you're saying is if the IPCC says we've got to reduce emissions or peak by 2025 and start going down, then we're hitting a wall. So anything we do to stretch out the allowance for fossil fuels just makes that wall harder to hit, right? So this is difficult. This is very difficult. We're between a rock and a hard place, but unfortunately, the hard place is really hard, way harder than people realise, I suppose, as per the German Meteorological Society that Michael raised. Whoa, we're in a tough place. Maybe, Elia, I'll just ask Svetlina now whether she's got 5 simple solutions that we can all just pass and go home, because you've painted a tough picture. Thank you. We'll come back to our conversation in a minute. Svetlina, tell us how to solve this problem.
Okay, we're jumping straight to the solutions. Okay, that's fun. But as a first step, absolutely, I would say that we need to block this and veto this particular proposal for gas and nuclear to be considered sustainable, and then try to also really think of how to rectify the damage already done by all the discussions and negotiations that actually led to this decision. Because both within the EU, among member states, among policymakers, this has been a heated debate, but the implications have been immense even beyond Europe. So what Elia was talking about and what Michael was also hinting towards is that this has really had implications for the financial regulatory space globally and how different countries approach this issue, but also what this means for more climate vulnerable countries and not that affluent regions in the world, especially the context of the current situation and the Russian aggression in Ukraine with the high gas prices and what this means for their energy transition. For instance, and now even though the EU is considering, different member states are considering diversification efforts of their gas supplies from Russia, other countries are buying gas at high peak prices, and the market for gas will continue to stay tight and with very high and volatile prices. And to seek to invest more in gas when we actually have the solutions, more energy efficiency, more investments in renewable as an immediate reaction to the crisis. So this is pure madness, doing more of the same that actually led us to this situation. So even globally, there is a lot that we need to start fixing in terms of credibility and the direction of travel of other countries and other regions, for instance. So during the EU and African Union summit in February, the hypocrisy of the European Union was called out for trying to label gas as sustainable, while in the same time trying to limit investments in Africa for gas to be seen as a transitional fuel. So I think what we've learned from the situation in Ukraine and the high energy prices and the high cost of living is that actually as I said, it's an absolute madness to seek to be doing more of the same. And globally, we have to also see how to rectify this with other jurisdictions and other more vulnerable countries. Now, that being said, I have even prior to the situation with Russia and Ukraine, I have been discussing with the private sector and investors how they see whether for them it's more useful to have like an exclusion list, like a red list of things not to invest in, or a clean green list. And what I have noticed is that if someone wants to invest in something polluting at the expense of, reputational risk, investment risk, economic risks, they would do so anyways, regardless of whether it is in the taxonomy or not. What investors and the sector actually needs is to know in what to invest, as Elia was explaining. So the market needs the clarity and it needs the certainty. And I know that we're talking about energy transition and an energy sector here, but to me, it would have been, it was even in the beginning, it was a more clear cut than some other sectors. It's no secret for anyone that solar and wind are clean energy transition technology. Although now with the discussion on gas, apparently it was not that clear cut for everyone. It wasn't that obvious for everyone. But when we look at different sectors, which is actually what the taxonomy is meant to be doing, when we look at different sectors, transport, manufacturing, agriculture even, buildings, renovation of buildings, construction of new buildings, it is incredibly important, and it's not that clear cut that investors know what is sustainable. This is why the taxonomy is so important, and we're actually risking the usability of it by the private sector because it's a voluntary tool after all. We're risking this clarity and usability for those difficult to invest in sectors. And I here want to say that just to go back to the transitional element of now gas and nuclear are both meant to be, as they're drafted, as transitional sustainable activities. But let's not forget that this was meant for technology that does not have any other alternative. Let's take manufacturing of cement, for example. We all know that it's not completely sustainable, but we need it. We need to manufacture cement, and there are strict criteria and there are certain ways in how we can improve that process. So it is really frustrating to see how gas is forced into that same category when we actually have the actual technology and the alternatives. And in the same time, it's completely entirely violating the technological neutrality idea of the taxonomy. So now, just to remind people who are not that familiar with the design of the taxonomy, we have green contributing to climate mitigation criteria, and then we have the do no significant harm that is like a minimum safeguard to ensure that no harm is done. And the way that gas is being forced into the taxonomy is even the criteria is even lower than the do no significant harm for other energy alternatives. So this is, as you said, like for people like us here on the call who have been following the taxonomy or have bothered to look in detail into the different criteria, it is absolutely obvious that there is no space for it there in this particular sustainability green transitional activities. And maybe in conclusion, let me say that I'm probably not helping here with the solutions, but I do agree that transition planning is important. But again, because the taxonomy gives you the certainty of how you hit different targets, how you transition over time, and can help you really provide more clarity there. Still, like recently, we have looked into the what the new situation with the Russian invasion in Ukraine means for Europe and globally. And I just want to finish with that, just summarize some of our most recent findings, is that It's no secret that different countries have disproportionate dependencies on Russian gas, and seeking to invest more in LNG capacity and seeking to invest more in gas is only perpetuating their economic dependencies on the fuel. It's keeping the demand and the market, the demand and price high, and the market tight, the global market, is not actually helping those countries transition. On the contrary, it's perpetuating the lock-in effects. It's even worsening the cost of living crisis, because the prices will continue to stay high. So it's no solution to the high costs. And it's definitely not the direction of travel of what we have seen with the Repower EU, and where the investments are actually needed, what the taxonomy was originally meant to be doing, to help people have the clarity and transparency of the investments that need to go into renewables and energy efficiency, and other sustainable activities.
Svetlina, just to be clear, are you saying that in your view, the CDA is not consistent with Repower EU? Are you going that far?
It's not. It is not, absolutely not. I actually have to check every week now, but actually the investments that go into Russia, not the investments, the amount of money going to Russia from gas, even currently from the EU, keeps increasing every minute. Currently, it's close to 59 billion. Since the start of the war, but there are also estimates that because of, if gas is forced into the taxonomy and eventually passes, this would result there are some estimates that I have seen that this will result, in increased investments in gas infrastructure in Europe, which even if we try to diversify, the lowest estimate would be like 4 billion additional taxonomy aligned spending that goes into Russia annually. So this is 4 billion annually. So it is not aligned with the direction of travel. It is not aligned with Repower EU, and it's not helping solve the issue of embargo of supplies from Russia. It is only perpetuating the problem and prolonging the current situation we are in.
Thank you, Svetlina. I want to go to Jonas now. I just want to say, by the way, that Michael Bloss has had to jump off. He got called into a meeting just a little while ago. Who knows? Maybe it's around the CDA and the taxonomy, and maybe the Commission saying they're withdrawing it. Who knows? But he had to jump off the call. He sent his apologies. Jonas, you and I have been talking about this for a long time. Give us your take in the context of everyone else did. Your take on what's actually happening and where does this go?
Well, Sean, I guess we kind of get to know each other a while ago when this all more or less started, at least the part of it that's linked to the taxonomy. And I guess I should say I've been angry for a very long time about much of this. Well, there's a lot of details in this. It's a complex piece of, the whole taxonomy is a complex piece of work, and it links up to a lot of different legislation in the EU that makes it all rather obscure to anyone who's observing this from the outside, and many also from the inside. But I think before I go into any of the details, I think it's worth mentioning what needs to be the key argument for stopping what is now on the table for the co-legislators, and that is, of course, what I think all the speakers here, what you started talking about as well, Sean, I've been alluded to, which is the insane war of aggression that is going on in Ukraine, where Europe is basically bankrolling it, and where we know that the details have not actually been much of discussion about how this came to be. There was never much discussion about details or narratives that have been behind, the inclusion of gas and nuclear in the taxonomy, and in particular in the context of gas. It has all been about politics and politicizing a file that was meant to be, setting the gold standard. And the main argument has been, in particular in the regions that are now, the worst exposed to the gas crisis deriving from the war, has been that gas and being able to continue to invest in gas is a matter of energy security. That has maybe not been an open argument, but it's been a very strong part of why this has actually come to be. And the pressure on the Commission from many of the member states that are now, of course, either being shut off from Russian gas or are shutting themselves off from it, has been that they need to be able to continue to invest in this in order to have energy security when they're phasing out coal. And aside from the points about how that is set up in the taxonomy itself, that must be clear to the coal legislators. This is no longer anything that makes sense. Gas cannot be framed in energy security. It's the reason why we ended up in this mess in the first place. And I think it's also worth pointing out that in the case of the taxonomy, we know also the Russian gas lobby in particular has been very much pushing the narratives that are ended up in the details of what is now on the table for vote in Parliament and Council. So I'll get into that a bit, but I think it's also worth pointing out that I think this was also discussed in the last event where I wasn't able to take part in the series, where it was pointed out that the Commission has been breaching its mandate with this file. I think that's true for several of the delegated acts that are linked up to this, including also the one that is now proposed from the Commission on criteria for what should count as renewable hydrogen, delegated act under the Renewable Energy Directive, which linked directly into what is in the criteria for gas here in the taxonomy. Of course, the taxonomy based on criteria that are not yet defined, and I'll get back to that. But again, we see a case where the Commission is going far beyond this mandate. And I think in addition to the energy security point, this is a clear reason for Parliament and Council to draw some clear red lines in the sand, excuse me. So back to what is actually on the table. I said I've been angry about this for a long time because we've seen the gas lobby being able to unfold a set of narratives for the last decade. Sean, you're on mute.
I know, classic mistake. Tell us about the anger. What got you angry? I mean,
yes, I'll get to that. So the gas lobby has been able to get away with unfolding a set of narratives, which I think has been partially because of that energy security point, where a lot of people in politics have felt that being close to gas is not something that exposes you negatively because there's part of the context of we need to phase out coal. And so getting away with that sort of gas bridge story, which has never been defined in any way, what is a gas a bridge to, which is now obviously dead. I mean, the German government very quickly when the war started declared the so-called gas bridge dead. But it was never any, real talk about how that bridge was working in the first place. But that bridge and that whole narrative around it has been making it possible for the gas lobby to be inside the warmth, let's say the cozy place of European politics for a long time.
I think Jonas, we need to explain this to our listeners.
Yes.
There are two aspects of this argument. One argument is that gas reduces emissions on our way to renewables because it's too hard to do lots of renewables or energy efficiency required as an interim measure. That's been a narrative. And as a result, pretty well every national climate change plan of the world has a bit of gas in it as part of the transition. So, if not in energy generation, then in all those other areas. But there are two things that have become clear in the last couple of years. The first thing, folks, is that the window to reduce our emissions has got shorter and sharper because we've been so unsuccessful over the last 30 years. Last year, emissions grew 6%. They've got to peak by 2025 and go down 50% by 2030. Like, this is tough. So the opportunity to build new infrastructure that has emissions associated is gone. And as Elia said earlier, the IPCC has basically said that existing and planned fossil fuel will get us over 1.5. So the planned, let alone the prospective, kind of got to go out the window. And the International Energy Agency said this very clearly in its net zero report last year, that there can be no new fossil fuel infrastructure if we are to meet a 1.5. But there's an extra thing that's happened. And the extra, think of this as a detective story, found another clue. In satellite monitoring over the last 10 years, especially the last 3 years, we've discovered a lot of this satellite monitoring is funded by the European Union. In fact, we've discovered huge blowouts in methane leakage around the world, in Texas, in Turkmenistan, and in Russia. And what we now know is that gas is 80 to 84 times as potent as CO2 if released in the environment. So if you just have a 3% leakage factor, you know, your gas plant, once you take that into account, may well be as bad as a coal-fired power station. And this is terrifying because it means all our transition plans for the last 20 years kind of have to be thrown out the window because we've got so much leakage everywhere. Unless we can suddenly make the whole system globally leak-proof really quickly, and BP, for example, has said it's going to do this, but it's going to take them 10 years. We've got to halve emissions in 8 years. Whoa, this has become an extra difficulty on top of the fact that even if you don't take into account leakage, the International Energy Agency, the IPCC prognostication apply. So, and the truth is, not everyone's across this. The geopolitics of Ukrainian war, the Russian war in Ukraine, have forced us to deal with this. But it's a, to be honest, it's a relatively new concept, isn't it?
It is, but I think also there are a couple of things that are important to point to in the criteria, which have been, part of things that made me very angry, and these are what I would describe as fake narratives, or they might not even be fake; they're just narratives, which is part of why this is so problematic. So there are two main things I'll point out. I mean, the one is maybe the most obvious one, where you have a criteria that describes an average over 20 years. Of emissions from gas, which doesn't have any, sort of clawback function or any sort of enforcement coming along with it, which means that any investment in gas can claim that you will meet this average over 20 years period, but you will not, of course, be forced to come back 20 years later and give back the money if you weren't actually meeting the criteria. So, that one I think is fairly obvious to point out as problematic. The other one, I think, is something that we have seen unfolding in a lot of different parts of EU legislation, and that's why I think it's important to highlight it here, is the term that we see in pretty much every energy-related legislation from the EU in the last few years: low carbon and renewable gases. These are two terms that are yet to be defined in any legislation. We see them in the gas market package. We see them in the renewable directive. We see them everywhere. And the renewable gases are now supposedly being defined by a delegated act from DG Energy, which is under consultation this month, before it will be voted by Parliament and Council, which is also very obscure with a lot of details that are difficult for most folks to understand, but which basically indicates that, I think, Leo, you mentioned earlier, there are some questions to be asked about the availability of hydrogen and renewable hydrogen and the infrastructure. I would translate that into, this is a bullshit narrative, 2025, and the scale we're talking about, and all of the different sectors of society that are subscribing to the current hydrogen hype, without any criteria being defined for what renewable hydrogen actually is going to lead to this pressure growing on the Commission to water down the criteria and to let, in fact, not only nuclear be producing this hydrogen, but gas, baseload electricity in a lot of EU countries will be running on gas and even coal in order to produce the hydrogen that is going to be used to greenwash gas in the taxonomy.
This is very emissions inefficient, right? Incredibly inefficient.
So it's energy inefficient to the level of insanity, but that doesn't matter because it was never supposed to be happening. This is not something that is going to happen. It's just a narrative. So in order to enable investments to happen now, you say that they have to be hydrogen ready. And we see that in a lot of sectors. We see it in steel, we see it in part of the chemical sector. People saying we're going to be hydrogen ready and seeking to get investments, climate investments into running on hydrogen in the future, with zero plans to actually provide that hydrogen in from renewable electricity, and at least you could say for those sectors that hydrogen is needed. We need to have hydrogen for a lot of the industry, but to produce hydrogen from burning gas, in order to produce electrolytic hydrogen from burning gas, which will have a much higher emission than producing actually hydrogen from the gas itself, and then using that to fill the pipelines and potentially burn it in a gas plant, the emissions coming out of that are absolutely insane. And this is being used as an excuse to continue to bankroll Russia's war of aggression. So there are so many errors in this that, it's hard to make it up, but it has never mattered. It was never supposed to be something that was going to be put into action. It's just a set of criteria that are about future narratives that enable investments to happen without any clawback criteria. And that's why this has to be wiped off the table, because this is not something that can be enforced.
Svetlana, put your hand up, dive in.
I wanted to continue on the arguments that Jonas is making, that these narratives are indeed extremely harmful for investments, both coal to gas switch, gas as a bridge fuel. It was never really meant to be a bridge fuel, but somehow this narrative keeps popping up in legislation, and also the hydrogen ready criteria. And here I wanted to mention that because we have been looking at the marginal application of the taxonomy for public finance as well. So in the Recovery and Resilience Facility, those of you who have followed the criteria for gas as well, it was this massive loophole that they forced into the Recovery and Resilience spending, EU funding, and it was designed as do no significant harm criteria for gas that member states can use to fund their gas projects, and it exactly had those criteria: coal to gas switch, hydrogen ready switch over time. And now the European Commission has taken this do no significant already massive loophole, and he has used the same narrative, almost the same identical criteria, even worse, I would argue, on several accounts for the emissions, for example, and have used this as green, absolutely green for the taxonomy. So if that's not greenwashing, I don't know what is.
Leah, your hand's up, dive in.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here because I think this is super important to talk about. I mean, I fully agree with what Jonas said on, the actual utility of using hydrogen in this kind of context. I mean, it's extremely inefficient. So I think we're on the same page there. And just to, I'm glad that you mentioned the RRF, because that's something that I worked on before I left the Commission, and because when I first gave my introduction, I was talking about, how do you make sure that those criteria are complied with? The big difference between something like the RRF and private investors is that, irrespective of whether we agree that DNSH condition should have been there, whether gas should have been in at all, just on the basis of how the fund is structured, there are people who are experts in the topic who will analyze the way in which the project presented by a member state is set out, and whether it can actually comply with those conditions. So whether there is a plan in place to have a certain level of blending and things like that, be that hydrogen or biomethane or whatever you have it. And obviously it's different for CHPs, for example, than for CCGTs, but you have a very detailed analysis of the proposal over the lifetime of the project. You don't have that with a private investor. So to ensure that those criteria, irrespective of whether the criteria are good or not, to ensure that they're actually complied with is so much more difficult, and that is a big danger when you look at public versus private investment. And again, it doesn't matter whether we agree on the content or not. So just to say that, so and I think that speaks to what Jonas said earlier, when you end up backloading these kinds of requirements, you get into dangerous waters.
So we're in dangerous waters, Jonas. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I mentioned to Sean before, I might actually have my daughter with me here, 4-year-old, you know, joining the call because I'm struggling a bit with, you know, finding solutions for childcare at the moment.
You're struggling with finding solutions for her future, Jonas. That's the real
Yes,
issue.
so, you know, that's part of it too. But as it turned out, luckily on a childcare point, my mother, so her grandmother, was able to take her to this kind of science center, and hopefully she's having fun there, you know, learning about promising solutions for the future. And you know, that's nice. But indeed, you know, promising solutions for the future is kind of what we're struggling with here, because again, I think the key point here is that European policy and the taxonomy in particular, which is supposed to set a gold standard, has to be based on evidence. And I know the efforts that you personally, Sean, and many of your colleagues who were in the technical expert group, you know, put down over the last couple of years before the report was handed over to the Commission. It was tremendous work, which, you know, helped to show that this was actually based on evidence, that it was based on, you know, an understanding of how these things play out also in a system perspective. And then we end up getting those exceptions carved out, which now, aside from the war context and how this doesn't make sense, we know where the politics came from, is just based on, you know, we want to believe that in the future in the near future, there is endless amounts of renewable hydrogen. I will call that, you know, the hydrogen hype for the purpose of this conversation, which is a nice narrative. And a lot of people want to believe in that because it is the future we want, you know, a lot of clean fuel in the near future that will just fix everything. But we have to be serious about this, and we have to, you know, this isn't X-Files. You know, I want to believe. I know that that's nice serious, but we need an evidence base for politics. And there is the only thing that this taxonomy file is linked to in this respect is a set of undefined gases, low carbon and renewable gases, zero definition, and the Parliament and Council are expected to just, you know, stamp that and say good stuff, and then see what the Commission comes up with in terms of definitions later. That is not acceptable from you know, from the perspective of the co-legislators. And I think that is a key message we have to get across here. This is based on narratives that have no foot in reality, that are not defined, and that therefore cannot be the basis for, you know, definitions in taxonomy.
So we have a proposal from the Commission that's at odds with the previous Taxonomy Act. In fact, there are some member states proposing to pursue legal action against the CDA if it goes through, based on it being out of line with the Taxonomy Act. I don't know about the legalities. You know, good luck to them if they can make that work. Certainly, our view of clump bonds is agreeing with you and E3G that this is not in line with the intent. But it is what it is. People will do stuff, and policy is a well, we live by compromise. Look at the astounding compromises we've made in Europe between some member states over different issues over the last few years in all sorts of areas, including, in some cases, approaches to media regulation. We'll leave that aside for a minute. The question I'm curious about is, even as this act of political compromise, it seems a bit out of kilter. I mean, we know that this was a policy pushed by Emmanuel Macron last year. You know, and he had a bit of a problem in France. He had a opposition leader who ended up being in the runoff against him, who had received enormous funding from Russian banks associated with the Kremlin and was very strong in supporting Russia. I'll say that because it's on the public record. This made life very difficult for him politically. He also wanted to push a position of French leadership in Europe and promoting nuclear, and we kind of heard some thoughts about why that was the case, whether it really is, around EDF's position financially and so on in earlier conversations. There are reasons why it's a good idea. I'm not going to say, unlike some of my colleagues, that nuclear is out of kilter with a climate perspective. It is very demonstrably and clearly low carbon. I have no problem with big hydrogen, personally, honest. We differ on this position out of the French system because it's low carbon. Do I think it's sensible to build new nuclear? It seems lunatic. No private investor will touch it. The waste problem, the decommissioning problem, the fact that half the plants in France are offline now anyway, it doesn't look like much of a solution. And the French, when they announced a raft of new plants in December, they talked about those coming on stream in 2046. Folks, 2030 is the year that counts. We need solutions to get emissions down fast. So at the very minimum, it seems like a diversion is what I'm going to say. But hey, but the gas stuff, that just seems so out of kilter now in terms of the politics of it. So I'm asking you a question really, and Svetlina, about how this is going to play out post-legislative elections in France, which are happening in a week or 10 days' time, which might take the heat off the Renew Party or the Macron's party going forward, given that the other half of Europe and the Eastern European half that originally was pushing for gas, which is part of this coalition, is now so focused on getting off gas and looking for alternatives. I mean, we need to switch in the short term. We need to bring in gas for LNG plants in Poland, do it. But there's no one talking about a future for gas anymore. So the politics, is this something that's just going to flip over quickly in the next few weeks and we're going to see a commission withdrawing? Or is there something, other reason going on to push it through that we haven't quite twigged on here? What's the real politics here? Forget about what we should be doing. We've heard enough of that. Svetlina.
Absolutely, and I agree with you, and it's no secret for anyone that it has been largely pushed, this particular delegated act has been pushed forward by France with the help of Finland and getting Central and Eastern Europe on board. What people don't pay attention to is that the reality of those countries is completely different, and the criteria, the way it is designed in the Climate Delegated Act, the second Climate Delegated Act, is not benefiting Central and Eastern Europe at all. On the contrary, it's pushing those really harmful narratives for gas that they need to switch their coal to gas, and in 10 years, think about how the same conversations that they've been having with coal now to think of how to switch off their gas, but with nuclear as well, because we have looked at the politics of nuclear and uranium supplies and generally the nuclear energy dependencies on Russia. In Central and Eastern Europe, 100% in some countries, unlike France. So France, despite the current situation with the current delegated act, will be able to really invest and consider their nuclear power plants sustainable. I'm not here probably playing devil's advocate here. I don't mean to say that the criteria is too strict in the delegated act, but for countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they're not that easy to comply with. On the contrary, the countries would really need to be jumping hoops there and do the impossible to comply with the criteria for both gas, I would say, with the switch to hydrogen, and
so they're not going to benefit.
Not at all. And so this is the reason why it is frustrating that this has been an extremely and only political conversations in those countries, and people do not actually look at the specific criteria and what it means for them in reality and how they actually need to comply with. If someone wants to invest in something polluting, or if a private investor, if any, wants to invest in nuclear energy because it's an extremely risky investment with or without the taxonomy, they would do so anyways. So for me, the reason trying to force this into the taxonomy and really put at risk its usability, and for example, German investors investing in different projects in the rest of Europe, but not only, this is an incredibly risky situation and a very thin ice that those countries are walking on. And I think we really need at this point to decouple the politics of it with the actual technical criteria and the actual implications of it. What I think countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, need is really to have a plan how to transition and how to get there, and a realistic one that takes into account the economic and financial reality, the different criteria, and their decarbonization trajectories and their transition trajectories, because this is missing. And everyone is pushing this narrative of coal needs to be switched to gas. And this is not helpful at this point. As you were rightfully mentioning, we don't have that much time left to do this right. And even from an economic and financial perspective, this is really locking in those investments for a very long time in those regions.
Jonas?
Yeah, just thanks to Svetlana for bringing my mind back to Central Eastern Europe, and we know that, as mentioned earlier, much of the political pressure on the Commission to make exceptions for gas in the first place came from the region and from Germany to a large extent, and some few other countries. Many times for genuine, concerns, based on genuine concerns about energy security and energy poverty. And these concerns are real, and in particular on the point about energy poverty, I think the energy security context is we don't need to discuss further, but the energy poverty point is a real issue for the region already, and now of course much more than it was. But that's also why these narratives that I was referring to earlier needs to be exposed, because the only thing that would be more expensive now than running on gas and investing in more gas, in Central and Eastern Europe, would be to run gas-fired power plants to produce electricity for electrolyzers that would get subsidies to produce hydrogen that should be used to fill the pipelines in order to fulfill the nonsense criteria in the taxonomy. So this is, because the energy loss in those processes, this is a completely meaningless narrative that if it will be put into action, and I think there are some real concerns about the Repower EU also in this respect. There's a lot of hydrogen in there without any plan to roll out renewables additional renewables in a way to actually meet the demand that will be created from that hydrogen if it's going to be produced by renewables. So there are some real concerns about how that is also going to drive energy costs. But the point is, if any of those targets that are set for a lot of sectors for hydrogen and all of those references to low carbon renewable gases are going to be met, then that would mean an insane increase in energy poverty across the regions. And that's why these narratives, even if they were true, they will be wrong, and they need to be exposed. We need to say there is no way that you can accept, voting for something based on narratives that have no evidence behind them, that have no real criteria, and once the criteria are defined, they clearly don't make sense. Thank you.
It's an interesting situation. I'm conscious we're coming towards the end of our time, but we have two countries, and Svetlana's basically said very clearly, France and Finland were pushing this. We'll probably benefit from this. Some of the few countries that benefit. This is so much at odds with the leadership position they have otherwise taken. I mean, the Paris Agreement is the Paris Agreement, not the Warsaw Agreement, because it was struck at the Paris COP were French diplomats driving it. They took a strong leadership position. So somehow or other, to find themselves promoting criteria promoting fossil gas seems at odds. And Finland's the same. I mean, the Finnish government has been admirable in many of its positions around climate and geopolitics and European Union, and yet to be supporting something which increases fossil fuel gas, which is not that relevant in Finland, but at least at the very minimum it undercuts. But I'm going to say, Elia, this is pretty common, isn't it? I mean, around the world, all the OECD member countries all have a similar story. There's a right hand that does something while the left hand does something. This is a feature of compromise politics. Where is that a fair criticism to make of the nature of certainly the richer countries, but really all countries in the world, apart from maybe Bhutan and maybe even Denmark nowadays?
Yeah, I think you've summarized it quite well. It's quite accurate. I think there is a debate to be had on what is our historical responsibility to contribute to achieving these goals across different geographies. And I think that just reinforces the message that everybody has been sending, that, if the EU is doing this, then, other countries might feel like they can do things that are possibly even less ambitious in terms of climate ambition, because they feel like, they're behind in terms of economic development. And there are, as I said earlier, there are lots of other priorities that are competing, and somehow there is a lack of coordination, I think, across a lot of ministries in different countries in order to get that consistent story of how can we achieve all of this together through some kind of systems thinking.
The signalling is important, isn't it? The day the CDA was released in January, in Maputo in Mozambique, the headline was, "Europe says gas is green." That was the headline of the paper. And of course, because there's a huge gas field that Mozambique would like to see developed, although it's been caught up in Islamic warfare, Islamic fundamentalist warfare at the moment. But we see this in Australia too, where the gas industry came out and lobbied the government publicly saying, Europe has now said gas is green, you've got to provide us more incentives, etc. Even though it's not going to work in a lot of part of Europe, this is like crazy signaling given Europe's ambition. So why are we doing this? But I think probably the most important thing, we have to take it back to the post-Russian invasion of Ukraine situation. If we need to drastically remove gas, the signaling there is particularly bad, right? Okay, so how do we take this forward? We've got a committee vote coming up in a short amount of time, as Michael Bloss said earlier. And then we have a vote in the European Parliament, likely to be in July or possibly September. What's the nature of discussion? What are you guys doing at E3G and Bellona to alert people to this? And how do you think the numbers are going and what have we got to do? Maybe Svetlina, give us a start.
Before I mention our efforts currently on this particular issue, I just wanted to complement what you were saying for the rest of the world. Have you also noticed that the taxonomy has been used to justify more exploration and drilling in Norway and in the Arctic, for instance, when drilling is not part of the criteria for gas in the taxonomy at all. And in the same time, it's used by people and by government to say, oh, you know, but it's considered now green in Europe. So let's do more drilling, more exploration and drilling. So this is just to give people the sense of how the implications are far beyond of what the taxonomy was originally meant to be doing to them for transparency in the European financial markets. For our specific efforts, we at E3G have recently published a briefing paper on the implications of and the new geopolitical reality in Europe and how the taxonomy gas and nuclear delegated act fits into this, or rather how it is at odds with REPowerEU, with the current situation, and how it does not how, on the contrary, is making things worse. And we look at both gas and nuclear. For nuclear supplies, it's also reliance on nuclear on Russia is also quite interesting across different member states. But what I have found probably not useful, but what I have noticed that the conversation is beyond the technical criteria. It is beyond the investment needs of certain countries. Everyone, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, is just fixated on gas and nuclear. It is not about investments. It is not about transparency. It is not about clarity in the financial markets. Everyone is so fixated on this. So I think it is important going forward. And we are generally having conversations with members of the European Parliament, but participating in a lot of more knowledge sharing events like this one, just to give people the sense of what this actually means, but also to really make sense of this particular decision in the current situation. And I have to say that the closer you go to Ukraine, the more you go towards Eastern Europe, the more you feel the urgency and the human tragedy of what is happening, both in terms of more refugees coming in, both in terms of prices, inflation, just the cost of living and the prices, the energy prices. So I think it is important to make sense of what this decision would actually mean on the gas and nuclear in the taxonomy for all these immediate realities for people. And as I have previously mentioned, it is not helping, making the cost of living even worse. It is perpetuating the current problems, just shifting one dependencies on other dependencies. And it's really perpetuating those really harmful narratives Jonas was mentioning about, rather than really fostering this sense of, okay, this is what we need to be doing, this is how quickly we need to be doing it, and this is how much money we need to invest in it. So I think having conversations with people, having conversations with MEPs, incredibly important, and just to put it in this new context, in this new reality in Europe in terms of the new geopolitical tectonic shifts.
Thank you, Svetlana. That's hopeful. Jonas, we're into the wrap-up stage here, and I'm going to be asking Elia about leapfrogging to green. We need to change the narrative in Europe, right? We need to be driving the leapfrog to green with a really robust understanding of what green is. We can't afford wishy-washy. We don't have the time. We can't afford things that inadvertently benefit the Russian war machine, which is what we currently see at the moment. So how we change that narrative from your perspective? What can we expect to see?
So I think just before answering that directly, I think it's worth saying that, you know, this is part of a wider struggle, I think, for the climate movement, for the environmental movement, which is that we're no longer fighting for targets. We're no longer fighting for where we need to get. The whole battle has changed from, you know, we're going to net zero, everyone's sort of accepted that, to what does it actually constitute net zero? And that's when you get all those narratives, that's when you get all those, you know, accounting trickeries that become extremely complex, that also confuse policymakers. So what we need to do here is, you know, turn this into clear messaging, make the information understandable. And, you know, I'm not then, you know, referring to my rants of furious anger, but rather, you know, trying to work with industry policymakers, but also with NGOs across the region, providing them with explainers. I think Lina shared one here in the chat that we've made for this event, trying to explain what is actually, you know, the criteria that are being proposed and why they are problematic, with some graphics and so on. But we need everyone's help in this. I think, you know, this is something that requires a massive effort now, because it is crunch time. The votes are coming up, and we need you know, these explainers to come out and link to some of the key things that are on everyone's mind. And it's back to those narratives, how this is actually not helping us out of you know, a situation that is driven by energy security, but maybe most importantly for, you know, everyone, is how this, what is on the table, is going to increase energy poverty in every member state, and in particular those that were most exposed to it in the first place, and those who have felt the need to get those exceptions in order to address that challenge. That this is actually delivering the exact opposite outcome. And if the definitions for renewable hydrogen, etc., those renewable low carbon gases, aren't sorted out in a good way, Repower EU is also going to lead to that exact opposite result. We're not going to get off Russian gas. We're not going to get off you know, energy poverty issues, and we're not going to reduce emissions if there aren't crystal clear criteria that, you know, link renewable hydrogen to actual renewable electricity production. And so this is the message we need to get out. This, what is on the table, is not what it promises to be, and we need everyone's help to do so.
Elia, let's just go global for a minute. This concept of leapfrogging to green, which I proposed, which is a way we're framing what we have to do. We don't have the luxury anymore of doing half measures in the hope we'll eventually get to green. How much is this taking root? You're focusing on transitions of the OECD and how economies, societies, corporations transition. How optimistic should we be? And any stories you can give us about how the rest of the world is looking at this question of leapfrogging, incommensurate with the targets that you talked about earlier, the IPCC talks about?
I can't speak for every country in the world. I can speak for myself, and I'm a technocrat at heart, and I truly believe in the original definition of transition activities in the taxonomy regulation, not least because I worked on it. And I think those should be the only exceptions where you can have, let's say, these incremental improvements, because there is no alternative. and because you are confident that you can do it in a way that doesn't hamper the development of alternatives. Everywhere else, I think, as you said it, the concept of leapfrogging is exactly the right one that we should be following. And I think it's perfectly possible. It just depends on it largely depends on the political will of countries and on the enabling environment domestically. If the enabling environment is there, and there is, especially in countries where transition finance currently is a big subject because they feel like they are not able to get investments for some of these more expensive technologies, there, we really need to look at technical assistance, blended finance, capacity building, things like that, in order to help them leapfrog in a way that makes sense within those domestic environments. So I personally am very optimistic, but I think in the sense, I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the solutions exist. We just need to move faster and make it a priority. Because once we make it a priority, which is something that we've done with the COVID recovery, I think we can get there. It's just a question of political will.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We need to wrap up. It's been a very deep, it's been an extended, it's been a rich conversation. You've heard that at least around this table, on the activist side at E3G and Michael Bloss at Bellona, we are concerned, and by implication, what Aaliyah's saying, but she works for OECD. They can't afford. It's not their role to take a strong view on this. I've got to be careful here. But if we have to turn peak emissions in 2025 and get emissions down 50% by 2030, it's certainly very, very difficult to see this particular CDA being consistent. So we've got a policy proposal by the European Commission for the Parliament, which is a political compromise forced upon the Commission by a couple of European countries, or a few European countries, which is out of kilter with our climate objectives. Let's be clear. That's what it is. Not only that, but it's out of kilter with our new objectives to meet the challenge of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And it's not consistent with what we need to do from our energy policy and so on. So unfortunately, it's a classic red herring diversion on the road when we just can't afford these diversions, red herrings, because we've got a hell of a lot to do to meet our objectives. But look, if it goes through, I'm going to say it's probably not going to matter anyway, because the investors are now beginning to come out and say they're going to ignore it. We've had the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, representing $50 trillion of investors, saying, actually, we are against including gas and nuclear in the taxonomy, and we expect their members to simply avoid it, in which case it is an extraordinary waste of political capital by the Commission on a topic that is not going to have much impact. Well, let's be clear, it's a waste of political capital by a couple of key member states who are driving this and forcing this to the Commission. I have to give the Commission a little bit of latitude here, because it seems very clear, as an outsider, that they've been pushed into doing this going forward. Hey, folks, and more importantly, members of the European Parliament that might be listening to this particular session, remember, we need to be sending the right signals to the world. We need to be sending the right signals to Russia. We need to be sending the right signals to our citizens about what we can do. The gas price hike that we are struggling with in so many countries in Europe, the fossil fuel price hike, is not something that's come organically. The director of the International Energy Agency said very clearly in a press release about 6 weeks ago, this was engineered by the Russian government last autumn. It has helped to fund the Russian war effort. We're more than funded so far. This is the world we live in. This is the kind of dependency that we can sign ourselves to in the future if we remain dependent not only on something that's against our climate policy, but relies on petro-gas state dictators supporting us. We need to change this paradigm. This CDA is not consistent with that, but much more importantly, a leapfrog to green is consistent with what we have to do to create a world that we want our children to live in, a world that they can live in and prosper in. Thanks for listening to us today. Good luck, everyone, with the project of creating a better world. And while we're at it, seeing if we can stop this complimentary delegated act in the European Parliament. Thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks, Elia, for your work in advising governments around the world on transitions and how we leapfrog to the future. I know you're not advising the European Commission. I appreciate that. But that global context is critically important to making decisions in Europe that are informed, intelligent, sensible, fit for future. Thanks,
Sean.
everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Until next time.
See ya. See you. Bye.